Welcome back to another episode of the React Native Radio Podcast. Episode 325, Legend List with Jay Meistrich.
Hey everybody, I'm Jamon, she's Robin, he's Mazen, and we are React Native Radio. Today we have a really cool guest, someone I've wanted to have on the program for a long time, and it finally happened. Jay Meistrich, my good friend. Of course, I'll have Jay introduce himself in a little bit here. But before we get into that topic, let's hear from our sponsor, Infinite Red. Infinite Red is a premier React Native consultancy located fully remote in the US and Canada. If you're looking for React Native expertise for your next project, hit us up at infinite.red/React Native. And don't forget to mention that you heard about us through the React Native Radio Podcast. All right, Jay, can you introduce yourself, talk a little bit about like your tech background? You've done some really interesting stuff.
Yeah. So I'm Jay Meistrich. I think I started coding when I was 10, when my mom sent me to a computer camp over the summer, and then I got kind of hooked. When I was in college, I joined a club at Carnegie Mellon called the Game Creation Society, and ended up making 5 games there.
Oh, wow. So
I got really into the games industry. I interned at EA Games, worked on a game called Boom Blocks on Nintendo Wii.
Nice.
And Nintendo Wii is a very restricted environment, so that was pretty intense. When I graduated, I went to Microsoft. I worked on Windows 7, and then I moved over to a research group where I worked on some computer vision and some high-performance touch devices. I think performance was always really critical to everything I was doing. It was always top of my mind. And then when I left, I got into web development, and the JavaScript world is very different in terms of how they think about performance. So that's been interesting.
Performance? What is that?
Yeah, right. So then I started a company called Legend. Back then it was called Moodoo, and then I renamed it to Legend because that was a bad name.
Moodoo?
Moodoo. MOO.do.
That's... I'm not going to contradict you on that one.
Yeah. So the original idea was that it was like more than a to-do, but it wasn't great.
I kind of like it.
Oh, thank you. So yeah, in doing that, I was making a web app and a mobile app. It was all local first, and it worked offline. Performance is always really important. At one point, I switched it over to React Native to get better performance, but it wasn't great. I had a lot of trouble with Flatlist specifically. Then I made a virtualized list on web, and one of my users ran the web app on his phone and said, hey, your web app is better than your native app. So then I migrated the whole app away from React Native back to web. So it's currently a React Native app that just wraps a web view.
Interesting.
Because of the list. So the flat list was the main problem.
Yeah.
That was like 5 years ago.
This is a little bit of a sneak peek into your personality, and I've come to really appreciate it. We've been friends for a while now. I think we met. Did we meet in Poland or was it Finland? I can't remember.
It was Poland.
Poland, yeah. In 2019, I think, something like that. So 6 years now. So we've been friends for a long time. You've shown me some of the stuff you're working on. It seems like the common thread here is almost always someone's like, hey, this thing sucks about the thing you made. And then you're like, I am not going to let that stand. And you go like disappear for months and come back with something that is just amazing.
That is accurate.
Have you always been this way? Like, or is that something that you've kind of acquired over time?
I don't know. Maybe it is.
Yeah, I might have just given you a personal revelation about things in your life.
Yeah. And that's also basically where Legend state from is in Legend, I had a state system that I had built because I previously used Knockout.js and then I switched to React, but I really liked how Knockout worked. So I basically built Knockout in React. Yeah. And then one of my friends said, oh, you should benchmark it. And I did, and it was okay. And then I basically blacked out for a week. And then after a week, I had something that was so much better. And then I decided to open source it, and that's Legend State, basically.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Legend State's awesome, and we can definitely talk a little bit about that too. But also you and Eli White are good friends, and you had actually, from what I understand, you were the person that hired him at Microsoft.
Yeah, it was Microsoft. Yeah, we hired him as the intern on our team.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I can't imagine. Eli White as an intern is a trippy thought.
So what was he like?
Yeah. As an intern, what was he like?
He was great. I think I originally liked him because he was very ambitious. And he seemed to
Yeah.
just love technology and told me about a lot of fun side projects he did in his dorm room and stuff. And I like that excitement.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. It's hard to get him on this program for some reason, but I'd love to have him. He's so humble. He's like, oh, there's way more interesting people to talk to. And
That sounds right.
yeah, that's just Eli. He's more of a behind the scenes guy, but I really appreciate him.
That sounds really interesting to me. I want to hear from the behind the scenes guy, but
Yeah.
Well, maybe you talk to him because I've already
maybe
tried
I
like
will.
5 times.
I also, after he graduated, I traveled with him for 9 months and basically spent 24 hours a day with him for almost 9 months. And it was great.
Wow.
We got along very well. That's good.
Well, that's
Yeah,
good.
I could see that.
The alternative would be pretty bad,
Right.
so.
You cut your trip short, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in case you haven't picked up on this yet, we're going to be talking about Jay's projects, specifically about Legend List, which is a much more kind of recent development. Of course, you can go to legendapp.com and go find Legend List there. You can also find Legend State, Legend Motion, and am I missing something?
That's it for now.
For now.
And then, of course, Legend itself,
Yeah.
which is an amazing app that does kind of productivity stuff.
Yeah.
So legendapp.com/open-source, I think, is where you see everything.
Yes.
Which we'll
That's
put in everything. Well, yeah, we'll put all the links in the show notes.
This whole like obsession with performance goes way back, as we hear, with the sort of game type stuff. I've been building a game lately and I understand why now, because if you're not obsessed with performance, you quickly find yourself running at 4 FPS in situations that you shouldn't be. So yeah, I'm sure that informed what you do today.
Yes, very much. And I think specifically one of my key lessons was in games, you pre-allocate everything because you cannot ever allocate anything during the game loop or
Right.
you'll freeze everything. And so I guess the concept of memory management was always deeply ingrained in me.
And then you started working with JavaScript people who are like, what?
Just
is
don't
that?
care. Yeah, exactly.
Well, which means there was probably a lot of low-hanging fruit for you.
Very much.
Yeah. A couple years ago, I guess it was now, we had Talha from Shopify on the show to talk about Flash List, which if you've been in React Native for a while, like when you think like highly performant, optimized scroll view, like people probably think of Flash List in addition to now Legend List. But people are probably wondering just like, what's the TLDR? Like, what makes Legend List different from Flash List? I'm not going to say better necessarily, but what makes it different?
So it's faster in every case I've tested, at least. A lot of people using it are saying it's faster. I can't claim it's always faster because I don't know, but every case I've tested has been. And that is one of the primary goals, is just to be as fast as possible. Also, Flash List does view recycling for performance, and that can do some really weird stuff. For example, if you have local state in your components and then you scroll, that local state doesn't go away. So you have to reset it because it gets recycled. So there's some weird stuff there. So Legend List, that's optional. It makes performance better, but you have to opt into it because it can do weird stuff. Other goals are, there's a lot of important use cases that just don't work in Flash List. So for example, bidirectional infinite lists don't work and chat UIs are hard to make. And then there's a prop in flat list, which is maintain visible content position, and that doesn't work. So that basically means that if you are scrolled to the middle of a list and then you scroll up and the items are different than you expect them to be, then the list will jump around. So we need to like resize the things above the screen in a way that doesn't jump the view. And that's pretty important, I think. And then the other thing is just, it's a lot smaller, so it's easier to customize for yourself or to contribute to. It's about 2,000 lines total. A lot of that's types.
Oh, wow.
So it's not too big. So there's been a lot of really great contribution, which has been awesome. Recently, there's been one guy specifically, Michael Bielenko, who's made huge contributions. And then we're now chatting every day and improving stuff. It's awesome. Open source is so cool.
It really is. And I have to ask you, how do you keep a library small? It feels like that in itself takes a lot of effort. It's way easier to add a bunch of code.
I guess I'm just careful to not add features that aren't really important. And if they are, then maybe we can do it as a plugin or an external thing on top.
Simple enough. Yeah.
In Legend State, for example, there's a lot of features that would be really cool to add. And so I made a plugin system so that users can add them after the fact. They don't have to be in the core.
That's cool. So you didn't want to say it's extremely fast. Your doc say it's extremely fast. People on Twitter are saying it's extremely fast. what makes it, and I know you mean it. We talked about your performance background and all that. So you mean it. You're just not, you don't want to say it. But what makes it extremely fast? And what does it mean to you if something is extremely fast?
So for this, I think specifically it means that the user should never see any blanks or gaps in the list. It should just look like it's a scroll view and not care about the virtualization. So I think I mean that in two different ways. Basically, the obvious one is just make the list really fast, do as little work as possible. But then also we can optimize the perceived performance. So one of the things we do, for example, with that is when you're scrolling really fast, instead of calculating the items that are currently on screen, we calculate the items that will be on screen in the next frame. So it looks like it's faster just by guessing what the user wants to see.
I like that, because performance really is about like, just do less. I was talking to Svetan, the Hermes guy, and during our last interview, hopefully it comes out in order so people understand what I'm talking about. But like the CPU on your computer doesn't run faster or slower based on what language is running, because it's all compiled down and running on the same architecture. And it's all like, it's, at the end of the day, it's doing the same stuff under the hood. So how do you make it fast? You have to make it do less. You have to really kind of think through and understand the logic of what's happening there and find ways to cache at the right time or do little tricks. It's kind of smoke and mirrors, a lot like games are, where you're doing smoke and mirrors stuff. You can kind of anticipate what's going to happen and try to do things early. Yeah, there's a lot of different techniques, of course. And even just like how you model the data itself, the state, what you're passing through can have an impact because there's some faster things and some less, performant things. And ultimately, when it comes down to it, you have to actually measure and care and iterate, because as you said, like just blindly using recycle view isn't necessarily going to make your app better, faster, more performant, everything. And just to, again, use like a game analogy, there's this thing in like 3D games called occlusion culling, which is essentially like if there's something blocking your view of something else, it shouldn't render that thing behind it. But that comes at a cost too, because you have to calculate it. Can you see any part of it? Like the object behind, even if a little pixel is sticking out, you have to know that. And that takes, that takes some processing speed. And so you have to really be thinking about, are you like a top-down world game that you're going to see everything anyway? Like that's not worth doing, versus if you're like walking through, hallways, then you probably should have it on, kind of similar vibe there. So a lot of measurement and a lot of experimentation, iteration. You start getting a little bit of a sense for that, like a spidey sense. I know that I was like doing some pairing with my brother Denton, who builds games. He's on Twitch a lot as Dead Slap. And if you I was watching him build some stuff, and he's a less experienced programmer, and I was like, I think what you're doing is going to lead to performance issues. He's like, yeah, I'm just trying to get it done. The other day he told me, yeah, I kind of abandoned that game because it was just hard to make it performant. I was like, okay, well.
Can I ask you a follow-up question to that? So you mentioned kind of how you're making it fast. What actually are like the main optimizations that you're doing to give you that speed?
So the main thing that's slow in React is re-rendering. So I have a motto, which is basically 3 words, which is render less often. And so we want to just make sure that we keep re-renders to a minimum. If you have to re-render the smallest possible amount. Because basically the way React works is a render runs your component, it computes all the hooks, it diffs the virtual DOM, and then it commits the render. It's a lot of work. The compiler is going to help with a lot of that by just automatically making it render less stuff, but we can also do a lot of that manually. So Legend List does that in a lot of different ways, I guess. So the main thing is it basically creates absolutely positioned containers on the screen, and then it renders items into those containers. And then as you scroll, it moves the container to the place where it needs to be to put a new item in, and then renders the item there. But re-rendering the whole array of containers would be slow. So we have basically a signaling system so that when a new container comes into view, we just signal that container, you need to re-render. And then that re-renders with the new item at the new position. And so it skips all of the re-rendering the outer list, which saves a lot of time. That's one of the things that flatlist does, is basically flatlist decides what items are in view and then renders an array of those items. And so that's just slower than rendering only the one container that changed. So that's the main thing. There's also a bunch of little tricks. Like, for example, if we need to change a style, then it uses an animated value to change that, so it doesn't have to re-render. So there's a bunch of weird little tricks like that too.
That's pretty cool. You're giving the illusion of scrolling while not scrolling. I feel like you're just kind of moving things around on the screen so that it's not re-rendering. It's still scrolling.
It's still a scroll view. It's still scrolling. It's just, we are figuring out what items should be in your view and putting them there. So it's not using a regular flow layout.
Yeah. And I feel like that whole no re-render, it's like re-rendering less, is the important part to take from here, so that, putting styles in animated value. I feel like that's the first time I've thought of that or heard of that concept to limit your re-renders. That's pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we experimented a lot with using animated styles for the positions of the containers, but that ended up being kind of a no-go because it renders at a different, on a different thread, I guess. So it would sometimes render before the new item got there or sometimes after. So it's better to stick with the React flow for that. But basically experimented with using animated values for updating styles very quickly.
So this is, you got me thinking about all kinds of different optimizations that could happen here. I'm probably going to hit you up afterward and ask if you've thought of these, which I'm sure you have, but you're doing this, at least right now, you're doing it all in JavaScript, which kind of blows my mind a little bit. Now, like FlashList uses some native modules. I'm a little bit foggy on exactly how they're using the native modules or like what they're using them for. I think you know a little bit more about this. Can you talk about FlashList and I think the underlying, recycler list view as well, and what's going on there and what are sort of the trade-offs of that architecture?
Yeah. So I'll caveat that I'm not an expert. I've just read the source a lot, but, and also I listened to your podcast interview of Taha, but, but basically what happens is it's recycler list view is all JavaScript, and that's what's doing the layout calculations and re-rendering everything and all the recycling. But then the problem you have with absolutely positioning things is React gives you an on layout event of the size of the element after it's already rendered. And so what'll happen is if you say the estimated size of the items is 100 and then they're actually 150, then you'll render two things 100 pixels apart. And so now they're overlapping. And so then on the next frame, it'll put it in the right place. And then the other way is if it's smaller than you expected, you have gaps. And so FlashList native component auto fixes the gaps for you. So even though you're rendering the React components with gaps, the native code fixes the gaps. And so I think we may eventually also do that, but the goal first is to try to just not have gaps or have the gaps be so fast that it doesn't matter. Because if there's gaps, but they're off screen and you don't see them, then that's fine.
Well, I thought you had to lay out with Yoga.
I believe FlashList also absolutely positions.
Okay, gotcha. So it's trying to do all this stuff in JavaScript as well. Why does that feel like it should be slow?
I don't know exactly why. I think there's just a lot of code in recycler list view. I don't fully understand what it's doing and why there's a performance difference, but it's much bigger. And I think the signaling thing we're doing, as well as the animated values and stuff, probably gives it a little bit of an edge.
Right. Yeah. Because at first you had legend state in there, and then you eventually pulled that out. But I assume you have sort of a slimmed down version of some signaling, going on there.
Yeah. I made the first prototype on a train using legend state, and then just proved out that it could work. And then I just built a tiny signaling system to use, so we don't have to bring in a dependency, because it has 0 dependencies, and I want to keep it that way.
I like 0 dependencies, and I think most developers do when they're bringing in a dependency. They don't want it. They're inviting legend list in, not all of its relatives, right? So they don't want to be maintaining everything. They just want that one thing. And I think for library maintainers, and I've been guilty of this in the past, adding a whole bunch of dependencies to your library, it's tempting, but you have a little bit of responsibility, especially if you want it to scale. If you are just building it for yourself and like, well, whatever, then that's fine. But we made this mistake, I think, with Gluegun, where Gluegun, the CLI library, brought on all kinds of dependencies, which, there's some positives and negatives there. I haven't finished it, but there was a kind of a successor that was going to be zero dependency, which turns out to be kind of hard to do.
Yeah. And on that point, I think I've tried to stay away from the native code as much as we can, because it's a problem for a lot of apps for out-of-tree platforms. You have to rewrite the native code for that platform. So I'd rather keep it JS as much as possible.
Thank you for that consideration with out-of-tree platforms, because yes, it can be a nightmare, and having to evaluate some packages recently for a client I was working on basically had me pivot completely and kind of change my direction because of the cross-platform compatibility stuff. So I think that's very important.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on that topic specifically, like, are there any new architecture considerations to keep in mind, or that you had to keep in mind while you were doing this?
I'm guessing if it's just JS, probably not.
Right?
Yeah, I thought it would only work in new architecture, and it was kind of inspired by Mo's talk at React Advanced about synchronous on layout. So I thought, oh, finally we can do this. But then once I actually built it, it worked fine in old architecture too. So I think we're just working on some stuff right now using more synchronous layout, use layout effect. And that seems to be a bit faster, but I haven't tested it against old architecture as much. But basically the answer is it works fine on both. Might be a little faster on the new one.
So you're telling me we could have had this performance the whole time?
I'm sorry.
And
Jay, where were we?
Yeah, come on. That's amazing, though. I assume because the new architecture gives us more tools, and
Mm-hmm.
more tools in the hands of someone who is as good a programmer as you, Jay, like that's just going to give you more options to make it awesome. I could see that being the case. But hey, I mean, that's still a huge win to be able to support the old architecture for those who haven't been able to upgrade yet, still getting, and it truly is very, very close to just drop-in replacement. There's very little like changes as far as like between flat list, flash list, and legend list, right?
Yeah, it's a drop-in replacement. There's a couple props. Like, for example, recycling is opt-in. So if you switch from flash list, you would want to enable that.
Well, on that recycling prop, I believe you call it recycle items. How does that differ from, like, elaborate on what this actually does? Because we were talking about recycler view earlier. Can you elaborate on this recycle items prop?
Yeah, so that makes it work basically how flash list works. So what the recycling does is it basically reuses all of the native views. And so it just does a lot less work because it doesn't have to dispose of the old one and then create a new one. It just updates maybe some text here and there. So generally, you'll have better performance if you use that. But it also has some real big downsides because basically what happens is your render item function just gets called with a different item. And so if it contained any internal state, then you need to reset the state when it gets recycled, which can be kind of hard to track. There can be some weird stuff like if you had a drawer open and it gets recycled, you have to close the drawer or it'll look crazy. It could do some weird things with complex elements like videos.
Especially if there's like animations between states. Like now you have to not animate between states because it should not, it should just be, that makes sense.
So it makes it just weird and hard and you have to do some wild stuff. And so with things like videos or really heavyweight components, when an item recycles back into view, you might see a flash of the old content before it switches, depending on your app. So basically recycling is great optimization, but it can also do some weird stuff. And so we've tried to make it just as fast as it can possibly be without even needing recycling. And then you can optionally opt in if you want.
Performance, obviously huge, recycling views, things like that. And this is really what everybody's asking for with our lists. So it's awesome that you're really focusing on this, but I want to know about other goals for Legend List. It's not probably just the fact that you can be performant. I mean, you mentioned earlier about making chat interfaces better. There's like maintain scroll at end and things like that. What else are in bi-directional infinite lists and whatnot? What else is like really like, I guess, talk about those things and anything else that you find important with building with Legend List.
Yeah. So the bidirectional infinite list thing is basically the thing I mentioned before of the maintain visible content position is if you prepend items at the top of the list and you estimate that those are all 100, say, and then you scroll up and it was actually 150, it'll push your whole list down by 50 pixels. And then that looks awful. And so maintain visible content position just makes that not happen. And it adjusts the things above you so that it doesn't move your positions. So that is very important for being able to scroll up infinitely. And so that lets you do bidirectional infinite scrolling, which is important for chat, or if you wanted to make a calendar that can go infinitely in both directions, that kind of stuff. It's very important for a lot of apps. And then for chat apps, if you have 2 messages in your chat, then you need those 2 messages to be at the bottom. And so the way every other list works is you have to invert the list and put them in the wrong order. And then the messages appear at the top, but actually at the bottom because it's inverted. But then the way inverted works is it applies a transform scale of -1, which
gotcha.
Which when I first heard that, it blew my mind. But that makes it really hard to do animations because you have to come out of the transform somehow. You can't do shared element transitions, that kind of stuff. So that makes stuff go crazy. So the easier solution is if the content is smaller than the scroller, just add padding at the top. And so then the items are at the bottom. So I've had a lot of people say, when are you going to support inverted so I can make a chat? And I say, just use the align items at bottom, and then that
works. Sounds almost too easy. Like,
yeah.
And then the maintain scroll at end thing is if you're near the bottom and new items come in at the bottom, it just keeps you scrolled at the bottom, which good for chat apps.
Yeah, well, I found that out the hard way. Again, talking about my game because, that's what's top of mind. But I spent forever building this lobby system, and I added a chat to it, and I was testing it and everything seemed fine. But I realized later I never actually tested it past the scroll. So like I would test it like 5 different, messages, and everything was cool. And then I was actually like in a lobby with my brother, across the country. And we were coordinating, what we were going to do in this mission with our, in our lobby. And it hit the end of the chat, and all of a sudden it would just scroll to the top slowly, like animated, and then scroll back to the bottom. And I have no idea why it was doing that. And it was super, super annoying. And every message, didn't matter if you put it or they put it, it would do that. And I was like, okay, yeah. Cause I'm not working with React in here. This is all like Godot and GD script and stuff. And, menu systems are where I really miss React. That's where it would be really nice.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I guess in conclusion, there's a lot of important use cases that just didn't work in the old list. And I've spent like 3 conferences asking people, what are your problems with lists? And then kind of tried to solve all of them. But
that's smart. We should do it. Can we do that with keyboards next?
Oh yeah. We got to get Jay on keyboards somehow.
I don't know about that. But I'll tell you.
Can we get keyboard aware legend list?
Legend keyboard.
One thing that's a bit silly is I don't currently have any need for a list. Like
that is a bit silly.
Yeah, it's just it needed to be done, so I'm doing it.
It did need to be done. Someone needed to do it, and we needed someone who had this like performance superpower, which you seem to
more of an obsession,
have, which is awesome. Yeah, that's how most superpowers are.
That's. Yeah. I mean, that's usually what makes a superpower.
So question for you, Jay, this is the last one. We got to wrap up here, but is this ready to just drop in and start using right now? I know that like as of the recording right now, you're basically preparing to drop 1.0. It's getting really, really, really close. By the time this actually airs, it should be out. But are you feeling pretty confident about that?
I am. Yeah. Since it's in beta, I've had a few people dropping it into their apps, and it seems to be going pretty well. Found a few interesting edge cases that we're fixing. And yeah, so I think, especially by the time this drops, I would say, yeah, it's ready to just replace.
Yeah, that's great. And you don't have to turn on Recycle View if you don't want to mess with like the complexity that brings. But if Legend List by itself isn't doing the job, you have something kind of heavy in your cells, and like rebuilding that every time is just not doing the job, then of course, enable recycle items and actually go and do the work to make sure that they recycle properly.
There's also a set of hooks like use recycling state, use recycling effect that can help you with resetting the state. So like use recycling state, you give it the initial state, it'll just automatically reset to it when it recycles.
Oh, now that's amazing. So that would actually save a lot of headache. I guess, yeah, animated stuff or, things like that could be a little bit of an issue. But.
Yeah. And then use recycling effect, you just like close the drawer or whatever. And so that'll just get called whenever it recycles and help you clear the state out.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. But if you have no animations and like especially if your cells don't change much or they're just informational. Seems like a no-brainer. Really cool. Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Jay. There's way more that we could talk about. Legend State itself, your sync system, which I think is amazing. And of course, Legend Motion, which a lot of people don't really know about. They only know about Reanimated. There's just so many things that you've created that are really cool. And I appreciate you being in the React Native community and helping us out with all these things.
Oh, thank you.
And you're on Blue Sky and Twitter.
Yeah.
Your handle is...
On Twitter, it's Jay Meistrich, the letter J, and then my last name. And on Blue Sky, it's Jayz, JAYZ.us.
Perfect. Yeah. And
I love that Blue Sky lets you do that.
yeah,
Yeah, it's great. I got that domain years ago.
yeah. I see you at conferences all the time. So definitely keep an eye out if you're at any React Native or React conferences. And sometimes others, you're big on local first. So there's some conferences you're going to for that. And I would encourage people that are listening to this podcast, say hi to Jay. Jay's awesome. Really, really loves to talk about tech and talk shop. In my experience, he's always willing to hear your use case, loves to hear how his stuff is working within your app.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I think that's all we have time for today. So we will wrap things up. Robin, do you have a mom joke?
I wouldn't call this a mom joke, but it's a really great insult the next time your friend's being a doofus. You're like a software update. Every time I see you, I think, not now.
That's a good insult. Only my nerdy friends are going to get that. Though,
Yep.
Which I guess that works.
I don't know. Everybody has to do software updates, maybe.
Yeah, that's true. That's, yeah.
Relatable.
That's my mother-in-law. All right. We'll talk to you all later. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.
As always, thanks to our editor, Todd Worth, our assistant editor, Jed Bartosky, our marketing and episode release coordinator, Justin Husky, and our guest coordinator, Mazen Chami. Our producers and hosts are Jamon Holmgren, Robin Hines, and Mazen Chami. Thanks to our sponsor, Infinite Red. Check us out at infinite.red/radio. A special thanks to all of you listening today. Make sure to subscribe to React Native Radio on all the major podcasting platforms.